The morning I found the violation notice taped to my tool shed door, I was already running late to fix a pressure valve issue that affected half the neighborhood's water supply. My name is Xavier Hughes, and I had been living in the Meadowbrook Springs subdivision of suburban Atlanta, Georgia, for 3 years. The irony of the bright orange sticker demanding I remove my heated tool shed within 14 days wasn't lost on me, considering that same shed housed every piece of specialized equipment I used to maintain the community's private water system. But HOA President Patricia Whitmore wouldn't know that, would she? She had never bothered to ask what I did for a living or why I needed that particular structure on my property. I ripped the notice off the metal door and read through the formal language about architectural violations and community standards. The shed, according to Patricia's carefully worded document, was an eyesore that didn't match the aesthetic guidelines outlined in Section 12 of the HOA covenant. Never mind that it was tucked behind my house, barely visible from the street, and painted the same neutral beige as every other structure in this cookie-cutter development. The shed wasn't just storage. It was climate-controlled because the pressure gauges, calibration equipment, water testing kits, and electronic monitoring devices inside couldn't handle Georgia's temperature swings. I had invested nearly $15,000 into that setup when I took over as the community's water system manager 2 years ago. The previous manager had retired and moved to Florida, and the HOA board, in their infinite wisdom, had hired me as an independent contractor to handle everything related to our private well system and distribution network. I pulled out my phone and called the number listed on the violation notice. A cheerful recorded voice informed me that HOA office hours were Monday through Friday, 9 to noon. It was Saturday. Of course it was. The pressure valve wasn't going to fix itself, so I unlocked the shed and grabbed my toolkit. The heater hummed quietly, keeping the interior at a steady 68 degrees. Rows of labeled equipment lined the walls, each piece essential for different aspects of water system maintenance. The monitoring computer in the corner blinked with real-time data from sensors throughout the neighborhood's underground pipes. I loaded my truck with what I needed and headed to the pump house on the east side of the development. Mrs. Chen from Willow Court had called yesterday evening to report low water pressure. When I checked the system remotely, I'd spotted an anomaly in valve cluster 3 that needed hands-on attention. The pump house was another point of contention with the HOA, though Patricia hadn't made an issue of it yet. The small cinder block building sat on common property, partially hidden by landscaping. I had the only key besides the emergency one kept in the HOA office safe. Inside, the mechanical heart of Meadowbrook Springs hummed and gurgled, pushing water from our private well through filters and into the neighborhood's pipes. The valve repair took 40 minutes. Nothing complicated, just a worn gasket that needed replacement. I tested the pressure, confirmed the readings looked good, and sent Mrs. Chen a text that her water should be back to normal. My phone rang as I was locking up the pump house. Unknown number, but with an Atlanta area code. "This is Xavier." "Mr. Hughes, this is Patricia Whitmore. I'm calling about the violation notice on your property." Of course she was calling on a Saturday when it suited her, despite the office hours listed on her own paperwork. "I just saw it this morning," I said, keeping my voice level. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Hughes. The structure behind your home violates our architectural guidelines. It needs to be removed or you'll face daily fines starting on the 15th day. Mrs. Whitmore, that shed houses all the equipment I use to maintain the community water system." The equipment that keeps everyone's taps running. A pause. Then, in a tone that suggested she was smiling, "That's not my concern, Mr. Hughes. You can store your work equipment elsewhere. The structure is unapproved and must go. It's climate controlled because the equipment is sensitive." We're talking about water quality testing gear, pressure monitors, calibration tools. I can't just throw it all in my garage. Then rent a storage unit. The violation stands. You have 14 days. She hung up. I stood there in the morning sunlight, phone still pressed to my ear, wondering how this woman could be so aggressively ignorant about the infrastructure that supported her own home. Did she think water just magically appeared in her pipes? Did she imagine the water quality reports that landed in her mailbox quarterly wrote themselves? Back home, I photographed the violation notice and started drafting an email to the HOA board. There were 5 members total. Patricia as president, Jim Caldwell as vice president, Susan Morton as treasurer, and 2 at-large members whose names I couldn't remember off the top of my head. I explained the situation clearly and professionally, attached photos of the shed's interior showing the equipment, and cited the section of my contract with the HOA that required me to maintain proper storage for all water system management tools. I hit send and tried not to think about it for the rest of the weekend. Monday morning, I got a response, not from Patricia but from Jim Caldwell. His email was apologetic in tone but firm in content. The board had voted unanimously to uphold the violation. I had 14 days. The email suggested I could apply for a variance, but the application fee was $500 and approval could take up to 90 days. In the meantime, the structure had to go. This was insane. I called Jim directly. "Jim, it's Xavier Hughes. I just read your email." "Yeah, Xavier. Look, I'm sorry about this, but Patricia's really dug in on the shed issue. The shed that houses equipment for the water system, the system I'm contracted to maintain. I understand that, but the architectural guidelines are pretty clear. The structure wasn't approved before construction, and it doesn't meet the aesthetic requirements. I built it 2 years ago. Why is this suddenly an issue now?" Jim sighed. "Patricia's been doing a neighborhood survey. She's hitting everyone with violations for anything that doesn't match the original covenants. She got Jenkins on Oak Street for his basketball hoop, the Patels for their garden gnomes, Martinez for his boat in the driveway. You're not being singled out. Those are decorative issues. This is functional infrastructure." "I hear you, Xavier. I really do. But my hands are tied. Patricia's the president, and she's got Susan and the other board members convinced we need to crack down on violations or property values will tank." I pinched the bridge of my nose. "So, what am I supposed to do with $15,000 worth of sensitive equipment?" "Apply for the variance. It'll probably get approved eventually." "Eventually doesn't help me if the equipment gets damaged from improper storage." "And you want me to pay $500 for the privilege of asking permission to keep doing my job?" "I'm sorry, Xavier. That's the process." We ended the call with nothing resolved. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my laptop screen, trying to figure out my next move. The logical part of my brain said to just comply. Remove the shed, find alternative storage, jump through whatever hoops Patricia wanted me to jump through. But the stubborn part of my brain, the part that had been growing increasingly frustrated with HOA overreach over the past year, said absolutely not. I had attended exactly 2 HOA meetings since moving to Meadowbrook Springs. Both had been tedious affairs where Patricia held court over minor issues with the self-importance of a Supreme Court justice. The first meeting had involved a 30-minute debate about whether the community pool could stay open until 9 p.m. instead of 8:30. The second had featured Patricia lecturing a young couple about their mailbox being the wrong shade of black. I started reviewing my contract with the HOA. I had signed it 2 years ago when the previous water system manager had recommended me as his replacement. The pay was decent for what amounted to about 15 hours of work per week, though emergency calls could happen anytime. The contract specified that I was responsible for all aspects of the water system maintenance, from routine testing to emergency repairs. It also specified that the HOA would provide access to the pump house and would not interfere with my ability to perform my duties. That last part seemed relevant. I drafted another email, this time copying the entire board and citing the specific contract language. I pointed out that removing my equipment storage would interfere with my ability to perform my duties. I requested a meeting to discuss the issue before any fines were imposed. Patricia responded within an hour. Her email was curt. The violation had nothing to do with my contract and everything to do with architectural compliance. The two issues were separate. The fines would begin as scheduled if the structure wasn't removed. I called my buddy Derek, who was a real estate attorney in Marietta. We had gone to Georgia Tech together, and he had helped me review the HOA covenants before I bought my house. "Let me get this straight," Derek said after I explained the situation. "You're contracted by the HOA to maintain their water system, but they're demanding you remove the building where you store the equipment you need to do that job. That's the situation. And this shed is on your property?" "Yeah, behind my house. Barely visible from the street." "But you didn't get HOA approval before building it." I hesitated. The previous water manager told me the HOA had always been hands-off about work-related structures. He had a storage container on his property for years, and they never said anything. "But you didn't get written approval?" "No." Derek was quiet for a moment. "Okay, so technically they've got grounds for the violation, but demanding you remove it when it's essential for performing work they're paying you to do, that's arguably a breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. They can't hire you to do a job and then prevent you from doing it. So what do I do? Document everything. Every conversation, every email, every piece of equipment in that shed and why it needs to be there. If they start fining you, you'll have grounds to fight it. And Xavier, you might want to start looking at your contract termination clause, because if this gets ugly, you may want to walk away." I didn't want to walk away. Despite Patricia's nonsense, I liked the work. The water system was well designed, the neighbors were mostly pleasant, and the pay helped cover my mortgage. But Derek had a point. If the HOA was going to make my job impossible, what was the point of staying? Wednesday afternoon, I was testing water samples in my shed when someone knocked on the door. I opened it to find Patricia Whitmore standing there with a camera around her neck and a clipboard in her hands. She was exactly what you'd picture when you heard the phrase HOA president. Mid-50s, helmet of blonde hair, yoga pants despite clearly never doing yoga, and an expression of permanent disapproval. Everything about her screamed that she had too much time and too much authority over too small a domain. "Mr. Hughes, I'm here to document the violation. Feel free. You'll see it's full of water system equipment." She snapped several photos without entering the shed. "That's not relevant to the architectural violation." "It's completely relevant. This equipment serves the entire community." "The community's water needs don't override our architectural standards, Mr. Hughes. If they did, anyone could build whatever they wanted and claim it was necessary." I stepped outside and closed the shed door behind me. "Mrs. Whitmore, can you explain to me how you think I'm supposed to do my job without proper equipment storage? That's your problem to solve, not mine. You could rent a commercial space. use your garage, or build an approved structure. An approved structure would take months and cost twice what this shed cost. My garage isn't climate controlled, and renting commercial space would require me to drive off-site every time there's an emergency, which could mean the difference between a quick fix and a major system failure. She lowered her camera and looked at me with an expression of exaggerated patience. "Mr. Hughes, I understand you feel inconvenienced, but rules are rules. Everyone in this community agreed to follow the same guidelines. If we make exceptions, the whole system falls apart. This isn't a decorative issue. This is functional infrastructure. It's an unapproved structure, period. You have 11 days remaining." She walked back toward the front of my house, camera swinging from her neck. I watched her go, feeling my frustration crystallize into something harder. This wasn't about rules or property values or community standards. This was about power. Patricia had been given a small amount of authority, and she wielded it like a weapon, probably because it was the only place in her life where she had any control. That evening, I started making calls to other board members. I got Jim Caldwell's voicemail and left a message. Susan Morton answered but said she couldn't discuss pending violations. The two at-large members, whose names I had finally looked up, Robert Palmer and Linda Givens, both declined to override Patricia's decision. "She's the president," Linda said. "We trust her judgment on these matters, even when her judgment affects critical infrastructure." "It's just a shed, Mr. Hughes. I'm sure you'll figure something out." I wanted to explain that it wasn't just a shed, that the equipment inside was the difference between safe drinking water and a contaminated system, between adequate pressure and dry pipes. But Linda had already decided I was making a mountain out of a molehill, and nothing I said was going to change her mind. Thursday morning brought a new complication. I got a call from Tom Richardson on Maple Drive about discolored water. I drove over with my testing kit and confirmed what I suspected. Sediment in the lines, probably from construction work the city was doing on the main road outside our neighborhood. Not dangerous, but aesthetically unpleasant. The fix required flushing several hydrants and adjusting the filter system at the pump house. It took most of the day. I sent an email to the HOA board and all residents explaining the situation and assuring everyone the water was safe, just temporarily discolored. Patricia responded to my email with a separate message to the whole community, praising my quick response and thorough communication. The cognitive dissonance was stunning. She was simultaneously complimenting my work while trying to force me to remove the tools I needed to do that work. I replied to her directly. "I'm glad you appreciate my work. The equipment I used today to test and resolve the water issue is stored in the shed you're demanding I remove. Please reconsider the violation." Her response came back in minutes. "Your work is appreciated. The violation stands." Friday, I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. According to the community website, meetings were held the first Tuesday of each month at 7 p.m. in the clubhouse. That was 5 days away. I submitted a formal request to be added to the agenda to discuss my situation. Patricia denied the request. Her email explained that individual violations were not appropriate topics for general board meetings and should be handled through the established appeals process, which meant the variance application and $500 fee. I paid the $500. I had no choice. I filled out the variance application, attached documentation about every piece of equipment in the shed, included photos, wrote a detailed explanation of why climate-controlled storage was necessary, and submitted the whole packet through the HOA's online portal. The confirmation email said my application would be reviewed within 90 days. I called Derek again. "They're stonewalling me. Are you surprised? I guess not. What are my options? Wait for the variance approval, pay the fines if they start, or lawyer up and fight. But Xavier, fighting an HOA is expensive and time-consuming. You might win eventually, but it'll cost you thousands in legal fees. So I'm just supposed to let them push me around. I'm saying pick your battles. Is this the hill you want to die on? I didn't have an answer. Saturday morning, 8 days before the violation deadline, I was working in my yard when my neighbor Frank Mendoza came over. Frank was a retired electrician in his 60s, the kind of guy who actually waved when you drove past and remembered your name. Xavier, I heard about the shed thing. That's rough, man. Yeah, it's frustrating. Patricia's been on a tear lately. She hit my daughter up for parking her car on the street overnight when she visited last month, threatened to have it towed. Seriously? Yep. Street parking is limited to 4 hours according to some covenant from 1997 that nobody's enforced in years. But Patricia's apparently decided to enforce everything now. We talked for a while about HOA overreach, trading stories about Patricia's various campaigns against perceived violations. Frank mentioned that several neighbors were getting fed up, but nobody wanted to run against Patricia for board president because it was too much hassle. She's been president for 6 years, Frank said. Runs unopposed every time because nobody else wants to deal with the drama. So she just does whatever she wants. An idea started forming in my mind. How hard is it to call a special meeting to remove a board member? Frank raised his eyebrows. You'd need signatures from 20% of homeowners, and even then, you'd need a majority vote to actually remove her. That's a heavy lift, Xavier. But it's possible, theoretically, but you'd be making an enemy for life. Patricia doesn't forget. I thought about it over the weekend. Did I really want to start a war with the HOA president over a shed? But it wasn't really about the shed anymore. It was about the principle. Patricia was abusing her authority, and nobody was willing to stand up to her because it was easier to just go along. Monday came, and with it, a new problem. I was running routine tests on the water system when I noticed unusual readings from one of the underground sensors. The data suggested a possible small leak in a pipe section near the south end of the neighborhood. This was exactly the kind of issue that could become a crisis if ignored. A small leak could weaken the pipe, leading to a burst that would leave dozens of homes without water. I needed to excavate and inspect the pipe, which meant renting equipment and coordinating with affected homeowners. I sent an email to the HOA board explaining the situation and letting them know I'd need to dig up part of the common area lawn near Birch Street. This was standard procedure, outlined in my contract. The board had always approved such requests quickly because water system integrity wasn't something you delayed on. Patricia responded. Any excavation on common property required board approval, which would be voted on at the next regular meeting. That was 3 weeks away. I called her directly. This time she answered. Patricia, this is Xavier Hughes. I got your email about the excavation approval. Yes, Mr. Hughes. The request will be reviewed at our next meeting. This can't wait 3 weeks. If there's a leak, it needs to be addressed immediately. A burst pipe could leave 50 homes without water. I understand your concern, but we have procedures. All significant work on common property requires board approval. I've done excavations before for repairs. It's never required a full board vote. That was an oversight. We're tightening our procedures. The request will be reviewed at the next meeting. And if the pipe bursts before then I'm sure you'll handle it as an emergency. But preventive excavation requires approval. Those are the rules. I hung up and immediately emailed Jim Caldwell, Susan Morton, and the other board members, explaining the urgency of the situation. Jim called me back within an hour. Xavier, I agree this sounds urgent. Let me talk to Patricia and see if we can do an emergency board vote via email. I'd appreciate that. This isn't about bureaucracy. This is about preventing a major failure. Jim got back to me the next day. The board had voted, and Patricia had convinced the others that my concern was overblown. Without actual evidence of a leak, just sensor readings that could be anomalous, they weren't going to approve unnecessary excavation. I could resubmit my request at the regular meeting with more supporting documentation. I sat in my shed, looking at the monitoring computer screen, watching the data that clearly showed a problem developing. But without approval, I couldn't dig. And without digging, I couldn't confirm the leak and provide the evidence they wanted. It was a perfect bureaucratic catch-22. That evening, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I drove to the Birch Street location after dark with a probe tool and did a quick manual inspection. It took me 20 minutes of careful work to confirm what the sensors were telling me. There was indeed a slow leak in the pipe, right where the data suggested. I documented everything with photos and detailed notes, then filled in the small inspection hole I'd created. The next morning, I sent a new email to the board with all my findings, emphasizing that this was now confirmed, not just sensor anomalies. Patricia's response was swift and angry. I had violated HOA rules by digging on common property without approval. I was being issued a second violation notice and a $500 fine. The leak repair request would still need to wait for the regular board meeting. I called Derek again, and this time I was ready to fight. File a complaint against me for doing my job, while refusing to let me do my job. This is insane, Derek. It's also typical HOA behavior. Look, Xavier, you're in a tough spot. They're technically right that you shouldn't have dug without approval, but they're also being unreasonable about the approval process. If this goes to court, it'll be messy. What if I just quit? Walk away from the contract. You could, but check your termination clause. There's probably a notice period required. And if you leave them without a water system manager, they could argue you breached the contract. I pulled up my contract and read the termination clause. Either party could terminate with 60 days written notice. If I quit now, I'd be stuck for 2 more months of dealing with Patricia's nonsense, and the neighborhood would still need someone to manage their water system. The following Saturday, 4 days before my shed violation deadline, I received a group text from Frank Mendoza. He'd created a group chat with about 20 neighbors, all people who had been hit with violations or fines in recent months. The message was simple. Anyone interested in addressing HOA overreach, come to Frank's house at 2 p.m. today. I showed up to find about 15 people crowded into Frank's living room. Some faces I recognized, others I'd only seen around the neighborhood. Frank stood at the front, looking nervous but determined. Thanks for coming, everyone. I think we all know why we're here. Patricia and the board have been on a violation spree, hitting people for things that were never enforced before. Some of these are reasonable rules being applied too harshly. Some are rules that don't make sense anymore. And in Xavier's case, we're talking about interfering with actual infrastructure maintenance. I gave a brief explanation of my situation. Several people shook their heads in sympathy. Others shared their own stories. The Patels had been fined for their garden gnomes, decorative pieces that had been in their yard for 5 years without issue. Marcus Chen described being cited for having his trash cans visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though he'd been at work when the inspection happened, and had no way to know his wife had forgotten to move them. Jennifer Wu had been fined 3 times for her daughter's chalk drawings on their driveway. The stories went on. Patricia had issued 47 violations in the past 6 months, compared to maybe 10 per year in previous years. She was generating revenue through fines while making life miserable for residents. "So, what do we do?" someone asked. Frank pulled out a printed document. "According to the HOA bylaws, we can petition for a special meeting to vote on removing board members. We need signatures from 20% of homeowners. That's 43 homes. Then we need a majority vote at the meeting to actually remove her." "And replace her with who?" Jennifer Wu asked. Everyone looked around. Nobody volunteered immediately. "I'll do it," I said. The words surprised me as much as everyone else. "I'll run for president if we can remove Patricia." Frank grinned. "Now we're talking. Okay, who's willing to help collect signatures?" We organized quickly. Frank had printed signature sheets, and we divided the neighborhood into sections. We'd spend the next week talking to neighbors, explaining the situation, and collecting signatures. The next day, Sunday, I started my section. I went door to door on Maple Drive and Willow Court, introducing myself to people I'd only waved at before, explaining the situation, asking for their support. Most people were sympathetic. Many signed immediately, sharing their own frustrations with the HOA. A few declined, saying they didn't want to get involved in neighborhood politics. One older woman, Mrs. Patterson, told me Patricia was her bridge club partner and she couldn't possibly sign against her. By Wednesday, 3 days before my shed deadline, we had collected signatures from 51 homes. More than enough. Frank submitted the petition to the HOA board on Thursday morning. According to the bylaws, a special meeting had to be scheduled within 30 days. Patricia called an emergency board meeting for that same evening. I wasn't invited, but Jim Caldwell texted me afterward to let me know what happened. Patricia was furious. She called the petition a personal attack and accused me of manipulating neighbors who didn't understand the full situation. She wanted the board to reject the petition on procedural grounds, arguing that some signatures weren't properly dated or witnessed. Jim had stood up to her, for the first time apparently. He pointed out that the bylaws didn't require dating or witnessing for petition signatures. The petition was valid. A special meeting had to be scheduled. Patricia had then argued for the full 30-day window before holding the meeting. Jim had countered that they should schedule it as soon as possible, within 2 weeks. The board had voted 3-2 in favor of Jim's proposal. The special meeting would be held the second Tuesday of the month, 11 days away. But I still had another problem. My shed violation deadline was tomorrow, Friday. Friday morning, I got a certified letter. If the shed wasn't removed by end of business day, I would be fined $100 per day until compliance was achieved. I didn't remove the shed. Saturday morning, I received a bill for $100 via email. Sunday brought another $100 bill. Monday, the same. I paid none of them. Instead, I sent an email to the entire HOA board and copied Derek, my attorney friend, explaining that I considered the fines invalid because they interfered with my ability to perform my contracted duties. I cited the specific contract language and noted that I had filed for a variance that was still pending. Patricia responded that the fines would continue to accumulate and that failure to pay would result in a lien being placed on my property. That's when I knew she'd gone too far. An HOA could fine members for legitimate violations, but placing a lien on someone's property was serious business. And doing it while that person was actively maintaining critical infrastructure for the community. That was going to look very bad. I forwarded everything to Derek and asked him to prepare a formal legal response. The next few days were tense. I continued doing my job, managing the water system, responding to calls, conducting routine maintenance. The shed stood behind my house, unchanged, the equipment inside humming along. The fines accumulated. $400, $500, $600. Patricia sent increasingly threatening emails. I responded to each one calmly, reiterating that the fines were invalid and that I would be happy to discuss the matter at the upcoming special meeting. The Tuesday of the special meeting arrived. The clubhouse was packed. Frank had spread the word throughout the neighborhood, and easily 70 or 80 people showed up. Normally, HOA meetings drew maybe 10 attendees. Patricia sat at the board table looking like she'd swallowed something sour. Jim Caldwell sat next to her, along with Susan Morton, Robert Palmer, and Linda Givens. They all looked uncomfortable. Frank stood up to present the petition. He explained clearly and without emotion why we were here. Patricia had been issuing violations at an unprecedented rate, applying rules inconsistently, refusing to exercise reasonable judgment, and in my case, actively interfering with infrastructure maintenance. "This isn't personal," Frank said. "This is about how our community is governed. We need board members who balance rule enforcement with common sense, who understand that this is a neighborhood, not a prison." Patricia was given a chance to respond. She stood, and I could see her hands shaking slightly. "I've been president of this HOA for 6 years. In that time, I've worked tirelessly to maintain our property values and community standards. Everything I've done has been according to the rules that every homeowner agreed to when they purchased their property. If people don't like the rules, they can propose changes through the proper channels, but I won't apologize for enforcement." "What about Xavier's shed?" someone called out. "Mr. Hughes built an unapproved structure. That's a violation regardless of what he uses it for. He can apply for a variance like anyone else." "He did apply," Frank said, "and you're charging him $100 a day while his application is pending. Because he refused to remove the structure, the application process doesn't suspend the violation." Jim Caldwell cleared his throat. "Patricia, can I say something?" She looked surprised but nodded. "I've served on this board for 3 years now, and I've watched how you operate. You're dedicated, no question, but you're also inflexible. Xavier's case is a perfect example. He's maintaining our water system. He needs that equipment. We're paying him to do a job and you're making it harder for him to do it. That's not good governance. That's being difficult for the sake of being difficult." Patricia's face flushed red. "You're out of line, Jim." "No, I'm not. I should have said this months ago. We've all been afraid to push back against you because you make everything into a battle. But Frank and Xavier are right. This has to stop." The room was silent. Then someone started clapping. Others joined in. Within seconds, half the room was applauding Jim's statement. Patricia grabbed her papers and stood up. "Fine. You want to remove me? Go ahead and vote. I don't need this aggravation." She walked out of the clubhouse. We voted. The measure to remove Patricia as president passed with over 80% approval. Jim was nominated and elected as the new president. We also voted to remove Susan Morton, who had been Patricia's closest ally, and replace her with Frank. The meeting lasted another hour as we discussed various issues and policy changes. At the end, Jim pulled me aside. "Xavier, on behalf of the board, I apologize for the shed situation. Consider the violation rescinded and the fines nullified, and thank you for continuing to maintain our water system through all this chaos." I shook his hand, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. "Thanks, Jim. I appreciate it." The next morning, Wednesday, I was having coffee when my phone rang. Unknown number. "This is Xavier." "Mr. Hughes, this is Patricia Whitmore. You think you've won, but you haven't. I'm filing a lawsuit against you for defamation and harassment." I took a breath. Patricia, I haven't defamed or harassed you. I organized neighbors to exercise their legal rights under the HOA bylaws. You've destroyed my reputation in this community. You've turned people against me. You did that yourself by issuing 47 violations in 6 months. I'll see you in court, Mr. Hughes. She hung up. I immediately called Derek and relayed the conversation. Let her file, Derek said. She has no case. You didn't defame her. You exercised your rights under the HOA governing documents. If anything, her threatening lawsuit is harassment. Should I be worried? No. Well, she could file a frivolous suit that costs you money to defend, but she won't win. And if she does file, we can probably get it dismissed quickly and maybe even recover your attorney fees. Patricia never filed the lawsuit. Instead, she sent a resignation letter to the HOA board 3 days later, resigning from her position as an at-large board member and announcing she was putting her house on the market. According to neighborhood gossip, she told people she couldn't stand to live in a community that didn't appreciate her service. Most people were relieved to see her go. With Jim as president, the HOA board became functional again. They approved my variance application within 2 weeks. They also voted to reimburse my $500 application fee since the whole situation had been mishandled. The board went through all of Patricia's recent violations and rescinded about half of them as unreasonable. The water system leak I'd identified got repaired properly, with full board approval and support. We caught it before it became a major problem. Life in Meadowbrook Springs returned to normal, or rather, to a better version of normal. Board meetings started focusing on actual community issues instead of nitpicking violations. People seemed happier, more willing to engage with neighborhood activities. I continued managing the water system from my heated tool shed, which now had explicit approval to remain exactly where it was. The equipment inside continued doing its job, monitoring water quality and system pressure, keeping everyone's taps flowing clean and strong. Frank sometimes joked that my shed had become a symbol of the neighborhood's transformation. From violation to victory, he'd say with a grin. About 6 months after Patricia left, I was testing water samples in the shed when I heard a knock. I opened the door to find a young couple I'd seen around the neighborhood but never formally met. Hi, I'm Todd and this is my wife Alicia. We bought the Morrison house on Oak Street. Nice to meet you, I'm Xavier. We know, Todd said. We heard all about you from the neighbors, about the HOA situation and how you stood up to the old president. It was a group effort, I said. We wanted to thank you, Alicia said. We almost didn't buy in this neighborhood because the realtor warned us about HOA drama. But when we heard Patricia was gone and things had changed, we decided to go for it. We love it here. After they left, I stood in my shed surrounded by gauges and monitors and testing equipment, thinking about how strange it was that a fight over a storage building had turned into something bigger. It had forced the neighborhood to confront how it wanted to be governed. To decide between rigid enforcement and reasonable judgment, the shed was still just a shed, but it had become a catalyst for change. Jim proved to be an excellent HOA president. He was organized but not obsessive, firm but not inflexible. When issues came up, he looked for solutions rather than violations. He also made a point of learning about the community's infrastructure and operations, including spending a day shadowing me to understand the water system. I had no idea how much work went into this, he said as we checked pressure readings at the pump house. Patricia never bothered to learn about any of it. She just sent you emails when people complained. To be fair, most people don't think about water unless something goes wrong. That's the problem right there. People like Patricia see rules as the goal instead of the means. The rules exist to make the community function well. They're not supposed to get in the way of the community functioning. It was a simple observation, but it captured everything that had been wrong with Patricia's approach. A year after the shed controversy, I was elected to the HOA board as an at-large member. I hadn't planned to run, but Frank and Jim convinced me that having the infrastructure manager on the board made sense. I could provide input on issues affecting the water system and other community operations. My first board meeting as a member was surreal. I sat at the same table where Patricia had once presided, but the atmosphere was completely different. We discussed actual problems and found practical solutions. We debated a proposal to upgrade the community pool and decided to survey residents before committing funds. We reviewed the budget and identified areas where we could reduce costs without cutting services. It was almost boring. And that was perfect. The shed, meanwhile, continued to do its job. I upgraded some equipment, added new monitoring sensors, and installed better climate control. The board approved every change without question because they understood its purpose. Sometimes I thought about Patricia and wondered if she'd learned anything from the experience. Probably not. People like her rarely did. They moved on to other communities, other boards, other opportunities to wield small amounts of power over others. But Meadowbrook Springs had learned something. We'd learned that we didn't have to accept bad governance just because confrontation was uncomfortable. We'd learned that rules without judgment were tyranny. And we'd learned that infrastructure matters, even the unglamorous parts like tool sheds and water systems that most people never thought about. My heated tool shed still stood behind my house, painted its approved beige color, barely visible from the street. Inside, equipment hummed and blinked, monitoring the flow of water through underground pipes, ensuring quality and pressure, keeping the community running. Nobody complained about it anymore. And every time I unlocked that door and stepped inside to grab a tool or check a reading, I smiled a little, remembering the fight it had taken to keep it standing. The neighborhood's water continued flowing, clear and clean and reliable. And that was really what mattered. 2 years after the whole conflict, something interesting happened. The county was doing a survey of private water systems in our area, part of a new regulatory framework. An inspector came to evaluate Meadowbrook Springs' setup. I gave him a full tour: the well, the pump house, the filtration system, the distribution network. He took notes and asked good questions. When we finished, he looked impressed. "This is one of the better maintained private systems I've seen," he said. "Your equipment and monitoring setup is more sophisticated than some municipal systems. How long have you been managing it?" "About 3 years now." "Well, you're doing it right. The climate-controlled storage for your testing equipment is especially smart. Most private system managers just throw everything in a garage and then wonder why their readings are inconsistent." He wrote up his report and gave the community a perfect score. The HOA board sent around his commendation to all residents, and several people emailed to thank me for my work. Frank forwarded the email to me with a note. "Remember when Patricia said your shed was just an eyesore? Good times." I laughed and got back to work. The thing about infrastructure is that it's invisible when it works. Nobody thinks about the pipes under their lawn or the shed behind my house or the hours of maintenance that keep everything running smoothly. They just turn on their taps and expect water. That's exactly how it should be. My job was to make sure that expectation was always met, and the heated tool shed made that possible. Patricia's house eventually sold to a retired couple from Tennessee. They were friendly and quiet, the exact opposite of their predecessor. When I introduced myself and explained what I did, They seemed genuinely interested. "So you're the one who keeps our water running?" the husband Bill asked. "That's me." "Well, thank you. We're happy to know the system's in good hands." It was a small interaction, but it represented everything that had changed. Instead of suspicion and confrontation, there was appreciation and trust. The HOA continued to function well under Jim's leadership. We dealt with the usual issues: budget planning, maintenance schedules, the occasional dispute between neighbors. But we dealt with them rationally, without the drama and power trips that had characterized Patricia's tenure. I kept managing the water system, conducting tests, maintaining equipment, responding to issues. The work was satisfying in a quiet way. Every time I prevented a problem or fixed something before it became critical, I knew I was helping dozens of families. The heated tool shed remained at the center of it all, quite literally. It was ground zero for all my operations, the place where I stored equipment, reviewed data, planned maintenance schedules, and prepared for repairs. Sometimes new residents would ask about it when they saw me coming and going with tools and equipment. I'd explain its purpose, and they'd nod with understanding. No big deal, just a functional building serving a functional purpose, exactly as it should be. 3 years after the conflict, Jim decided not to run for re-election as HOA president. He'd done a great job, but it was time-consuming, and he wanted to focus on other things. Frank took over as president, and a woman named Carol Peters joined the board. The transition was smooth. That was another sign of how much had changed. During Patricia's time, board transitions were rare and contentious. Now they were just normal parts of community governance. I continued serving as an at-large board member, providing input on infrastructure and maintenance issues. It was good to have a voice in decisions that affected my work, and the other board members appreciated having technical expertise available. The community thrived. Property values increased, not because of rigid rule enforcement, but because people actually wanted to live in Meadowbrook Springs. Word got around that it was a well-managed neighborhood with reasonable HOA leadership. That reputation attracted good buyers and strengthened the community. And through it all, the heated tool shed stood behind my house, doing its job, housing the equipment that kept the water flowing. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a reminder of what happens when people stand up for common sense against bureaucratic nonsense. When they refuse to accept that rules matter more than the community those rules are supposed to serve. Every time I walked past it, I felt a sense of pride. Not because I'd won some petty battle with an HOA president, but because I'd helped my community become a better place. Because I'd shown that infrastructure matters, that expertise matters, that sometimes you have to fight for what's right even when it's uncomfortable. The shed stood as proof that one person could make a difference, that neighbors could come together to demand better governance. That change was possible. But mostly, it stood as climate-controlled storage for water system equipment, keeping gauges calibrated and monitors functioning and testing kits ready for use. Because at the end of the day, that's what really mattered. The water flowed, the system worked, and the community thrived. And my heated tool shed, the one Patricia Whitmore had tried so hard to eliminate, made all of it possible.